Number one, define a historic context, so we'll learn exactly what they are. Second, we'd like to look at the different types and ways to organize historic context. Then we'll talk about how you actually prepare a historic context and then finally how to use a historic context. And I think the reasons are fairly obvious, but we'll talk about a couple of the reasons that you would want to prepare a historic context. So first, what are historic contexts? They are patterns or trends in history by which a specific occurrence, property, or site is understood and its meaning within history or prehistory is made clear. And that's directly from National Register Bulletin 15. So resources don't exist in a vacuum. Every piece of historic writing, from the shortest academic paper to a historic resource study, relies on a historic context. Historic contexts are a fundamental tool for the identification of historic resources, and without a historic context, your historic resource study, it becomes meaningless data instead of a useful planning tool, and we all want our documents to be useful. So that's the real reason that we remind people in the cultural resources field that they need to prepare a historic context whenever you're doing a historic resource study or you're evaluating a building or structure, object, or district. So in plain language, a historic context tells the stories that explain how, when, why the built environment developed or looks the way it does. And the little illustrations I have to give credit are Virginia Lee Burton, The Little House. So it tells you how it goes from a very idyllic sort of farm community to a very developed city. So what is a historic context? We'll continue on with that. The National Register defines a historic context as the patterns or trends, as we described above, and they're the fundamental tool and really the basis for identification of historic resources. It's only with the historic context that the significance can be understood. It helps organize the major preservation activities that provide for the preservation of a wide variety of properties, telling the stories that represent an inclusive history rather than the small biased group of stories. And now in the historic preservation movement, you can see there's a big push to include underrepresented communities within the story of our history that we're telling, and a historic context is really a great way to do that. So that's sort of generally what a historic context is. It's often hard to break it down real simply in an hour presentation. The most common ways to organize a historic context are three ways: by theme, a geographically based approach, or a chronology, which is, I think, the most common in history, as we tell stories arranged by date. So we'll go talk about I'll show you some examples. You'll see that there are some overlaps between the different types of way to organize a context. For instance, here we have the tract housing in California, 1945 to 73. It was prepared by Caltrans, and you can see it's organized thematically, tract housing, post-war tract housing, and it's also a specific period of time, 1945 to 1973. It's also a statewide context. Another thematic context, water conveyance systems in California. Thematic by a property type, water conveyance systems, canals, pumping plants, checks, ditches, reservoirs, which is a storage facility, but you have to store it in order to move it. It's no time period, so it's within California history. It's also a statewide context. Some more examples of these ways to organize a context. Ooh, I'm missing one. So we'll skip that one. The one on the right is the mid-century modernism historic context from Fresno. It's a thematic. It's the mid-century modern period, and it's local. It's within the Fresno area. Again, more examples. The one on the left is the Sunset Builders residential tract. It's in San Francisco, and it was constructed roughly between 1925 and 1950. This is a really good historic context. It breaks down the property types in a really interesting way. So I believe that's on our website, and you can look at it. So it's very specific geographic area at San Francisco and in the Sunset Tract. The one on the right, which I apologize, it's a little difficult. It's Pebble Beach Historic Context Statement. It's confined to the area of Pebble Beach. It's one that was produced fairly recently. Another way to organize is based on chronology, so by a time period. The one on the left is the Japanese Americans in World War II. So obviously it's during 1940 to 1945. It's also a thematic. It covers the Japanese Americans in that period. It's a national landmark study, so it's also at the national, it covers the nation. The one on the right is San Francisco Modern Architecture and Landscape Design. From 1935 to 1970, that's a chronology, 1935 to 70, it's a time period, but it's also thematic in that it's focused on modern architecture and landscape design, and also a specific geography, which is San Francisco. Okay, so that's the basic introduction to some of the types. The steps for developing historic context. It's really difficult to break this down, but I tried to make it as easy as possible. And I'm going to go through the steps, and then I'll talk about them in more detail. So the first I would say is identify the concept, chronological, I can't say that word, chronological period and the geographical area of the historic context. Second, you assemble the information about the historic context. You collect information about the prehistory or history of the geographical area. You would include information on previously identified properties, so previous studies within that area. This is the fun part where you get to do the research and go to all the different archives and dig around and find good stuff. The next step is, well, within that area, you want to assess for bias and historic perspective, methodological approach, and an area of coverage. I think that becomes much easier once you start looking into it. Then the next big step is to synthesize the information and consider trends in settlement and development, aesthetic and artistic values, that's a typo there, research values. And then the final two steps would be to define the property types, identify the property types that you're going to find within your context, to generalize about the locational patterns, and characterize the current conditions. The final step would be to establish significance criteria. Okay, so that's the basic steps, and now we'll talk a little bit more detail and use some examples for this, putting it all together. So identify the concept, the chronology, and the geographical area. So for example, here we have the CCC resources in the state park system. So our concept is the CCC, buildings and structures. The time period would be 1933 to 1942. That's when the CCC operated in state parks, and generally I think that's when the CCC operated. The geographical area would be statewide, so for all 280 park units. I believe that's the number. So that's sort of the basic idea, the scope of your historic context. So the next step, assemble the information about the historic context. You would include information about previously identified properties. So the cover that I showed you was the first iteration of a context that was prepared for CCC. It was done in '93, and a lot of it was just a spreadsheet that included some resources that were constructed during the period. So after looking at that, you would assess for data gaps or bias. What you can see is that there is some historic context missing, some of the written narratives, and you would want to beef that up. So the third step would be to synthesize the information and prepare a written narrative. This is the point where you include the important patterns, events, people, architectural types, and cultural values that fall within the historic context that you're researching. This section does also include the historical overview, but don't limit it only to an overview or resuscitation of important dates that fall within that period. And in order to sort of broaden it so it's not just a historical overview, you're going to include some information about your property types. And those would be, based on form, function, association, events, physical characteristics. And most of you are very familiar with them. Property types would be residential, commercial, libraries, Carnegie libraries, public institution, railroad-related buildings, water storage or water conveyance. There's all kinds of property types, and you would have to look to see what you have in your context area or what that scope is. Next, continuing to put it all together, you're going to establish some significance criteria. And I put these together last night, so you can see they're a little bit in jest. But for my significance criteria and Happy City, and Happy is a town in Texas, any Italianate-style residence within the city limits is eligible for the Happy City Register. I don't believe they have a single one. Any buildings designed by architect Sparky McSparkerson is eligible for the Happy City Register. And any building associated with Bubba White Jr. is eligible for the Happy City Register because he's super important. Like I said, those are in jest, and I think it becomes very clear, or it doesn't become incredibly clear, but it becomes clearer once you have established your historic context. You've defined the property types that you found in your city. It will be, or your context area, say the CCC and state parks. It's going to become a little bit easier to define what the significance levels are for that particular group of resources. So that is the steps for putting it all together. And then after you have a historic context, and we're all going to assume that we have a fully developed historic context, we want to use it. So we're going to apply the historic context to an event of historic properties, because I believe that's ultimately why we're preparing these. In order to do that, you need to decide whether the resource is, you need to define the portion of prehistory or history of the local, state, or nation the property represents, whether the portion of the prehistory or history is significant, and whether the property has relevance and importance in illustrating the historic context, how that property illustrates that history, and whether the property possesses the physical features necessary to convey the aspect of prehistory or history. And that should look fairly familiar to you. It should sound a lot like National Register criteria or the concepts behind them. So this is nothing new. But your historic context will help you to develop your conclusions. So I thought what I'd do now is give you an example. This is the headquarters administration building in Big Basin State Park. And I'm only picking on state parks just because I wrote a National Register nomination recently for this building, so I know it. So, and I already just gave away the ending. You know it's eligible, but let's pretend like we don't know. So what, for this building, what is the historic context, and is the building significant? That's what we really want to get down to. So some facts about the building. Located in Big Basin State Park, that's pretty obvious. It was the first state park in the California state park system. This building was constructed in 1936. It was built by a CCC crew, and it was designed by Daniel Hull. Those are basic facts. Without a historic context, it's really difficult to assess whether that building, with just those few facts, is eligible. So potential context that we could identify for this building just right off the bat would be Big Basin State Park and the development of that park. The CCC in California, since it was actually built by a CCC crew. Architecture designed by Daniel Hull, and he was a landscape architect originally with the National Park Service and then came to work for the California State Park System. And then the park rustic style architecture, and that picture I flashed by you real quickly was a park rustic style building. So assuming we have a fully developed historic context now and we're reading through it, we have to identify which historic contexts the building would be significant under and which ones we want to put our effort into developing. And as you can see here, I've kind of made it a little easy for you. Big Basin State Park, it's definitely related to the development since it sits in Big Basin State Park, but really and we'll have some information about the development of that park, but the two contexts that we're really interested in are the CCC in California and the park rustic style architecture. And we will also talk about Daniel Hull in our historic context. And it turns out the building is eligible under A for its association with the CCC and the National Park Service California State Park Cooperative Program. And it's eligible under C as an exceptional example of park rustic architecture. And it would be easy to come to those conclusions once you have a well-developed context. And even though I have briefly presented this to you, I'm going to assume that that we're all going to have it and come to the same conclusion. It's really difficult to present a historic context within this quick of a time. But I just want to answer one question on the chat. It says, to be clear, historic contexts are not just for the built environment. I totally agree. I just happen to have a bias because I'm a historian, and I couldn't find any pretty pictures of covers of historic contexts for prehistory, but a historic context is also necessary for resources for prehistory and archaeological resources. So I just wanted to answer that real quick. So moving right along, the next example is one that I'm currently writing a nomination on, so I gave away the punchline again. We'll pretend like we don't know whether it's eligible. I mean, you look at the picture of El Teatro Campesino, and it doesn't look like much. So the facts about the building: it's located in San Juan Bautista. It was built in 1944 as a warehouse and used as a spinach packing plant. They did receive authorization to construct it during the war. Apparently you had to do that because they would be feeding the troops. So our troops ate spinach from San Juan Bautista. After the spinach packing plant closed, it was used as a bow and ribbon factory for a few years, and then in 1980 the building was purchased by Luis and Lupe Valdez and converted into a theater. It became the home of El Teatro Campesino. So potential context for this building: agriculture. San Juan Bautista is located obviously in a very rich agricultural area, and it was used as a spinach packing plant. It could be at the local level for just within that area, or it could be statewide. Everybody knows California is sort of a powerhouse of agriculture. It could be eligible within the context of manufacturing as a bow and ribbon factory. I really don't know much about bow and ribbon factory technology, so that's something I would have to research. Could be eligible at the local level, or who knows, maybe there was some important technology that they used within that factory, so it could be important statewide. And then finally, it was used as a theater, so it could be important within the context of theater. So I'm going to give you some more hints here. The context that that we're really looking at this point is theater. Um, Within the context of agriculture, yes, it was used for a spinach packing plant, but it doesn't appear that it was any different than in a lot of the other warehouses there. Manufacturing, I think the bow and ribbon factory was only there for a few years. The theater, El Teatro, it became their permanent home in 1980, and Luis Valdez is considered the father of Chicano theater. And El Teatro Campesino was the first sort of Chicano theater troupe. It's the farm workers theater. He started in 1965 doing skits during the grape strike. And then it evolved into a little bit more traditional theater company. And the other context that we're going to have to explore is Luis Valdez as the father of Chicano theater. He's a poet, he's a playwright, and an artistic director. So as you can see, we have our work cut out for us. But that's sort of an example of the historic context that we would develop for this type of resource. And we have a question here, which is, would the recent vintage of the Teatro Campesino eliminate eligibility until 2030? Well, hopefully I'll be retired by then, but no, we would have to make a criterion consideration G argument. And 1980 is pretty recent, and we're looking into that, and we think we can make that argument because it is considered the premier Chicano theater troupe. So the next question is, what is the period of historic significance, and where did the info come from local sources? We haven't decided what the period of historic significance is. That's a really tough one at this point. The theater started in 1965, but they didn't have a permanent home until 1980, which I just showed you a picture of. So the 1965 sort of protest theater is not associated with that building. It's a later period of theater for that company where they're doing more full-length plays. They're not doing the protest theater or the actos that they're known for. So that's something that we have to contend with. When would we cut off that period of significance? When do we end it? And the info came from about the spinach packing plant. We found the info in the local historical society. We've talked to Luis Valdez. He still happens to be alive and producing plays, and so we've done some interviews with him as well. So hopefully that answers the questions in the chat. So I'm going to move on so that Jay can start his presentation. But here's our prehistory example. Why should I prepare a historic context? When you look at this photo, for people who are built environment people, you may look at that and go, there's nothing there. Okay. But it happens to be Monk's Mound, which is located at Cahokia Mounds, and we know that that is incredibly significant as prehistoric culture. But you wouldn't know it just looking at the photo. You'd need that historic context in order to make that significance call. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to tell you to go forth and write a historic context. And now Jay is going to jump in and talk about the Latino context. Second.
Hey, am I live? Did you unmuted me? Okay, hello, this is Jay, and thank you, Amanda. I would like to maybe narrow down and focus the discussion to specifics, and that would be the multiple property submission format, which is a type of document for nominating properties to the National Register of Historic Places. Let me move on to the next slide. Get my mouse going here. There we go. Multiple property submission format. As Amanda stated, or at least inferred, context is all important in a National Register nomination. And one reason I think that we spend so much time talking about context in terms of National Register nominations is because that is the part of nominations that people seem to have the most difficult time with. And I've just got a simple picture, crude photograph of the bulletins up right now because if anybody is setting about to write a National Register nomination, you have to know these bulletins backwards and forwards. And so I want to impress that upon people and kind of burn it into folks' minds. In many ways, the entire nomination hinges upon a strong summary statement of significance. And I would argue that that summary statement of significance really is your contextual statement for the nomination. And that's why I've put up this crude picture of one of the National Register criteria, criterion B, because I often direct folks to read that first bold line at the top. Properties may be eligible for the National Register if they are associated with the lives of persons significant in our past. And so we want to see folks say or write that such and such property is significant within the context of the life of John Steinbeck, for example. And so that's kind of laying out your context. And then the rest of the significant section should set about to prove that thesis statement, so to speak. And the same for criterion C, design construction. A property may be eligible if it represents or embodies the distinctive characteristics of a type of architecture. So your statement of significance should say XYZ building is significant because it embodies the distinctive characteristics of a type of architecture. And so that is the beginning of a good contextual statement. So because it seems to be difficult for folks to do this, and in fact, I really liked what Amanda said about instead of a grouping of small bias stories, which seems to be what folks want to write about when they're not familiar with context. They'll want to write, you know, this house in my town was where Dr. So-and-so lived, and he lived there for 10 years, and he was an important doctor in the town. But it really doesn't place that into a broader context. For example, why did this person come to the town? Was there something going on in the town, perhaps health-wise, that necessitated a doctor or made it beneficial for a doctor to come to that town and set up practice? That's looking at it more in a contextual way. Because it seems that folks have so much trouble with that, the National Register has the multiple property submission format, which is a large document that writes all of this context up front so that each subsequent nomination does not have to include all of that broad context, all the things really that Amanda was talking about. There's a lot of little pieces and parts that she mentioned. Those pieces and parts can be written in the cover document of a multiple property submission. Keep clicking the wrong. Okay. And I wanted to show everyone the table of contents or the not the table of contents, but the parts of a multiple property submission. And of course there's an introduction, but I want to specifically focus on 3B, associated historical context, and then also Section F, associated property types. And then even go and then use a recently completed, really landmark multiple property submission completed by the Office of Historic Preservation about a year ago to drill in and look more specifically at context. And so these are all the contexts that are laid out in this multiple property submission. All of the things that Amanda talked about earlier. You could see that we have making a nation for Latinos in 20th century California. And then sub-themes, Latino immigration and settlement, Latinos in the media. So I'm hoping that you get a sense that if we have a radio station, for example, we just don't want to know when it began, when it ended, who worked there. We want to place it within a broader context of Latinos in California, their role in the history of California, and then maybe how this specific resource fits into that broader context. And we see here making a life, religion and spirituality, Latinos in sports and the arts, and on and on. So what I would like to do is go through some slides of different resources in California, some of them already nominated to the National Register within these contexts, or others that are just proposed. And I hope in doing so that it gives you an idea of what we're looking for and how we view properties within these contexts. So what is the advantage of the multiple property submission format? Well, if each National Register nomination requires this background context that we've been talking about, and oftentimes that context is 4 or 6 or even 50 pages, I wanted to show you how brief that context can be if you're nominating a property under cover of one of these multiple property submissions. So what I'm showing you right now is the entire context statement for a property that's being nominated under cover of a multiple property submission. It can be brief because all of that background has already been done. Now on to some of the specific properties. So this is proposed for nomination. It's a theater in Fresno. And, we could go on and on about when the theater first opened, who owned it, all those, I'll quote Amanda again, all those small biased stories. But I think to really demonstrate its significance, to link it with broader history, which will lend more importance to this specific theater, we look at it here as being significant within the context of Latinos making a life in California, and specifically Latinos in the arts. And you can also look at this theater within the context of business and commerce in Latino communities. So I hope that gives a little bit of a sense of the importance of having already pre-written these contexts in the multiple property submission, and then the importance of applying them and how to apply them to specific properties. Here's a Delano Pentecostal church. Would we want to just talk about this church in a vacuum? Not at all. We see this church as being significant again within Latinos, the context of Latinos making a life in California, and in the sub-theme of religion and spirituality and Latino culture. Our Lady of Guadalupe Church in Sacramento. Again, significant in the broader context of making a life and religion and spirituality in the Latino community, but I believe its real significance, the building's real significance, lies within the context of Latinos in labor history. This was the ending point of the National Farm Workers 1966 march from Delano to Sacramento. So it's highly significant within that context. So you could go on and on about the architecture of the church, perhaps, if it was significant. You could go on and on about the role this church has played in the Sacramento community. That's another possible context. But of course, for our purposes here, we're looking at it within, I think its most significant context is to look at it within the labor movement of the 1960s. We'll move on. Another property that's significant within the context of Latinos making a living and Latinos and labor history. In the middle 1960s, 2,000 female workers walked off the job here. They were working under terrible conditions, and they were not getting paid for the work they were doing. And so, again, I showed you an example earlier of that very, very brief, significant statement because the broader context had already been established. So if someone were to come and try to nominate this building, the Anjac Fashion Center building, all that context has already been done, and it would really take a very little effort to spell out the context. We would expect to see a description of the building, a brief description of what happened here, and then simply referring to the broader context spelled out in the multiple property submission. And again, another property that actually is significant within the context of Latinos in California making a democracy and struggles for inclusion. Another one of the long lists of contexts that I showed you when I showed you the associated historical context slide earlier. I'll move on. The Mission Cultural Center for Latino Arts in San Francisco, it's pretty self-evident. Making a living would be the context, and the sub-theme would be Latinos in the arts. And another interesting set of slides. The residence of Edward Roybal would be significant within Latino struggles for inclusion. Mr. Roybal was on the Los Angeles City Council and then went on to serve in the United States House of Representatives. I really enjoyed yesterday reading up on Eugene Obregon, who was a Medal of Honor winner. And the haunting thing for me is that today is his birthday. And then Chico Sesma was the first bilingual radio DJ in the Los Angeles region. And he also is largely responsible for introducing mambo and cha-cha to the Los Angeles region. So his residence would be significant within the context of Latinos in the arts. You wouldn't have to go out and do all the research on Latinos in the arts because it's already done in the multiple property submission. The Cayetano Juarez Adobe in Napa. This is a trick question. I came across this slide yesterday, and I wish that we could have a dialogue between all of you out there and us here in this office, because I'd like to know if I caught anyone in this little trick. This wouldn't be significant within the context of Latinos in 20th century California because the building predates that by at least 50 years, and I think probably as many as 80 years. So it's a completely different context. This building couldn't be significant within the context of Latinos in 20th century California. And as a side note, we specifically wrote that multiple property submission to only take in the 20th century because so much work has been done in the past on pre-20th century Mexican California. So, and just a few more and then I'll wrap up. The next, there's more pictures of the Adobe. And then the next two properties fall within the context of making a democracy, Latinos struggles for inclusion. The Lydia Killefer School, which has been listed, it's in Orange County. Its period of significance is 1942 to 44, and it amazingly was a school that was voluntarily desegregated in Orange County. And it is particularly significant because it took place before the Mendez ruling that legally required schools in Southern California to desegregate. And a couple of pictures of the Killefer School, one more, this amazing door. And then the Cypress Street Schoolhouse that you see has some integrity issues, but again, when we're talking criterion A, association with events, integrity becomes a little less of an issue than if we were nominating the property for its architecture. Cypress Street School functioned as a segregated school for Mexican children between 1931 and 1944. So it's significant under cover of the Latinos document, multiple property submission, under the context of Latino struggles for inclusion. Some historic pictures of the school. And then finally this Forsythe Memorial School for girls, which is significant under the context of Latinos making a life and religion and spirituality. So constructed in 1944 and operated until 1934, it's a rare surviving representation of Americanization attempts made by Protestant denominations to homogenize Mexican-American culture in Los Angeles. So, and finally, I just threw this in here, the next slide after this one, the amazing Maravilla handball courts in East Los Angeles. I wanted an example of Latino in sports, which is another context within the multiple property submission. So, and in fact, it hasn't been nominated to the National Register. It's a California Register property right now. So I hope that this maybe narrows down and focuses, gives some specific instances of the use of context and its importance, and at the same time plugging the multiple property submission. I hope that the slide that showed you how brief the statement of significance can be if you're nominating under cover of a multiple property submission illustrates how this document can facilitate facilitate writing nominations, as opposed to, we like to see at least 5 to 10 pages of context per nomination. So I have lots of questions.
Thanks, Jay. Actually, this is John again. It looks like the questions are coming in through the chat box. I just wanted to quickly encourage everybody to ask questions. For the people that are dialed on the phone, again, what you would do is press *6 on your phone if you'd like to ask in person. And if you just want to type in your question, again, it's on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. So, Jay, did you want to read the questions as you see them? I think the first question that was asked was from Matt Armstrong. He was asking about the Teatro Campesino.
I think Amanda covered those. I see. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I see down here, are there any historic sites included in the Latino multiple property submission? Is maybe the first question that hasn't been addressed.
Yeah, you're correct.
Right, okay.
I was looking at the wrong one. Yeah.
And you there have only been about 4 or 6 properties nominated under cover of the Latino MPS to date. So at this point, no historic sites, but certainly the document was written so that historic sites could easily be nominated under cover of the multiple property submission. I hope that answers the question. Does a criterion A finding require a historical context? I would say that criterion A in some ways requires a broader context than criterion C, because criterion C will always mostly be an architectural context. So absolutely yes, criterion A nominations require everything requires a historical context. The National Register will not list a property unless you demonstrate that it's significant within a historical context. And again, to be redundant, that's what the multiple property submission does. It writes that up front in a large document so that you, as the applicant, doesn't have to do so much contextual research and writing. Yes, and Amanda has answers for the next question.
I just wanted to address the question about, is OHP considering or working on an Asian immigrant experience? At this time, we would love to do an Asian American. That is a really big project. The city of Los Angeles just received a grant to do Asian American in Los Angeles, and I believe the National Park Service is working on a nationwide one. We would love to, but we don't have any plans or any funds currently to do that. And then, does the SHPO have an online contact statement database? We don't. We have something similar. We have a context library, and most of the ones that you'll see there are local, that we funded through CLG grants. It's not the entire list of contexts that we have. I am working on trying to get all of them up. The statewide ones are also listed there. And the person who wanted the copy of the Latino MPS, you can get a copy on our website. You can download it and print it off. And then, yeah, so, and then Jay wanted to answer the question about the main elements of the multiple property submission. So I'll let him go ahead and talk about that.
The only reason I wanted to jump in here, I had missed that question before, so we skipped ahead, but we had a similar discussion in the registration unit earlier this week. Isn't one of the main elements of an MPS to address non-contiguous properties? I wouldn't characterize it that way. Each property nominated under cover of a multiple property submission requires an individual nomination. So technically, yes, they would be non-contiguous, but not in the sense of a district that is non-contiguous. We're getting into the weeds here in National Register requirements, but the National Register frowns on a discontiguous district. So that's a whole different issue. So don't confuse the multiple property submission with allowing discontiguous district nominations. Think of a multiple property submission as allowing individual properties to be nominated in an easier fashion because all of the context is written up front. So yes, by nature, individual nominations are discontiguous, I would say. But anyway, did you already answer? Can we get? Yes, you can get copies of the Latino multiple property submission. It's posted on our website in that library that Amanda just mentioned, but also we may have a few hard copies left around from a short run that we published. So, further questions? Oh yeah, just as Amanda talked about, one of the requirements of creating a context is to establish a geography. I think you mentioned that. So too does a multiple property submission. Absolutely. In fact, while Amanda was talking, I was marveling at how everything that she discussed really is a requirement of the multiple property submission. So everything she said is intriguing to me, that's what's required for a multiple property submission too. It's just a different use of a context as opposed to a survey, for example. So the geographical, yes, there are geographical limitations. They can be immensely broad, like the entire state of California, or even the entire United States, or it could be the city of Sacramento. And you would spell that out. It's one of the requirements of the multiple property submission, is to submit or come up with that geographical data. I don't see any other questions, John.
Jay, I'm not sure if we addressed this or not, but I think there was a question about whether or not the SHPO has an online context statement database.
Yeah, if you go onto our website, and I believe it's under the heading of library.
It's tools.
Tools, library. All of our contexts are posted. Oh no, they're not.
Not all of them.
Not all of them. We're getting all of them up. Okay.
Generally, it's the most recent, and then the statewide.
Statewide context.
All of the statewide that we have, and then the recent CLG.
One thing I encourage anybody and everybody to do is to call us if you have any questions at all. We'll help you out and direct you to, if we can't get it for you right, we'll direct you to. Oh, John's going there.
Right. So if you look at the OHP website, and I think it's under, is it under programs, Jay or Amanda?
Amanda, is it under programs?
Oh,
No, tools. Tools.
Tools,
Yep.
Tools.
historic context.
There you go. Click on it.
These are the local. So that's it.
Great. There's quite a few here.
There's your
So
statewide historic context. Yeah.
right, and there's statewide down at the bottom, and then there's the Latinos context right there.
There you have it. Yes. So let me, since suddenly it seems fairly informal, I'll share with everyone out there that we would like to see more properties nominated under cover of multiple property submissions. So I think we have a strong bias here. Every presentation we give is to try to elicit nominations from all of you out there. I'm going to turn it over to Amanda.
Well, Jay has the bias of getting nominations. For me, I would like to see a really a full historic context and survey, and I'd like to see everybody use that historic context in the future for future surveys. We have a couple people typing. Do we have any other questions? Thank you for the suggestions about the multiple property subjects, World War II defense training locations. I know there's currently a nomination for the area in the desert where Patton Desert Training Center. That's ongoing. That's in the Mojave. And underwater shipwrecks. Okay, I'll add that to a list. We don't have any plans to work on logging camps of Northern California, but I can add that to the list. And I would agree there haven't been too many contexts that have been done north of San Francisco. But please suggest some if you have suggestions. One of the pushes that we've noticed from the National Park Service is they would like us to prepare, or they are encouraging preparation of contexts associated with underrepresented communities. We had applied for a grant to do African Americans in California, but unfortunately we didn't get it. The question about the public housing in California, there is a context that's nationwide for public housing, and there's a link on our website under the context that you can, if you go on to the side, I think it's on the side, if you just scroll down on, or can I, right here, there, public housing in the U.S. We haven't done one. There has been, so that may help you a little. Cold War sites. There is a, JRP prepared a, I believe it's Cold War context for, I don't know if it was one particular branch. I don't believe so. I'm not sure who funded it. Department of Defense. I'm looking for our copy so that I can add it to our website. I don't know where our copy is, sadly. And Jeanette has added that the National Register database has copies of the approved multiple property thematic studies. They do. And that's a good resource if you're looking for contexts. Yeah. Historic Native American sites and building context. That would be great. And I'll add it to our suggested list. It might be something that we could do in coordination with TIPOS and other tribes that would be interested.
Okay, so this is a last call for questions. It's now 1 p.m., so technically we're done with, but we'll leave time for a few more questions, or at least one more question if there are any.
For the YWCA, you might find some context in in National Register nominations that have been written for individual YWCA, but I can add that to our list. I don't know of any specifically, but that might be something you could search in the National Register database. I'll add that.
Okay, so it looks like we have no further questions, so I wanted to close up with a few comments. Thank you to Jay and Amanda for wonderful presentations, and I'm sure everybody is enlightened now. I see somebody's typing something in the chat box, so I'm going to wait a second here. One more question. So it looks like Catherine has a question.
So you're wondering whether you would weave in information about previously identified. You can. I think that might be useful, but it's you'll probably find, well, hopefully find contexts that are associated with those previously identified resources. But does that answer the question? I mean, I think technical studies, she's talking about survey reports specifically, not necessarily nominations. If you can weave it in, that'd be great.
Okay, wanted to thank both of our speakers and also encourage everybody to please become a member. It allows us to continue to offer programs like this for free. And also wanted to make a special offer today as we move over to the evaluation page. Please do leave your qualitative comments here. In 1 second, I'm going to also leave a spot for some
links.
multiple response questions. Give me 1 second. But as you're waiting for the multiple response form, on the right-hand side, you'll notice that there are some questions on today's program so that we could improve our programs. I encourage you to fill those out. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. We actually sold out. 1 second. We had 102 registered, which is the most we've had in a long time. So obviously, there's a lot of interest in these programs, and I'm trying to pull up the survey so that people can leave their comments. 1 second.
There's a question or their comment of, can the PowerPoint by Amanda be sent out to attendees? Jonathan, you'll probably post it on CPF's website, and I think I will as well, post it on our website, so it can be, you can access it that way.
Okay. Yeah, I'm having problems. I've never had this problem before with our multiple response, but what I will do is email a survey to people out by the end of the day. But the PowerPoint will be sent out. I'm happy to do that. I'll convert it to a PDF, and we'll do that. Thanks again, everybody, for attending. And please do, when you get the survey in your email, please do let us know how the program went. And have a wonderful rest of the day. I hope it was an informative session for everybody.